Imagine you are sitting in a Walgreens pharmacy. Not a hospital, not a specialist clinic. A Walgreens, the kind of place you go to pick up cold medicine and birthday cards and a bottle of shampoo on the way home. You roll up your sleeve. A technician pricks your finger, takes a single drop of blood, smaller than a raindrop, and tells you the results will be ready shortly. You are not worried, you came for a routine check. You are healthy, you feel fine. Then the results come back, and they tell you that you have cancer, or HIV, or that your heart is failing. And you believe them, because why would you not believe them? This is a medical test, in a pharmacy, approved by regulators, trusted by doctors, used by the United States military, endorsed by some of the most powerful men in America, former secretaries of state, former secretaries of defense, decorated generals. You go home, you tell your family. You make decisions, life-altering, irreversible decisions, based on what that drop of blood told you. And the results were wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not within an acceptable margin of error. Wrong in the way that only happens when a machine is not doing what anyone said it could do. Wrong in the way that only happens when the person who built the machine knew, or should have known, that it did not work. That happened to real people, in real Walgreens pharmacies across America. And the person responsible was not a shadowy corporation, was not a faceless institution, was not a nameless executive hiding behind a board of directors. She was a 19-year-old Stanford dropout with piercing blue eyes, a black turtleneck, and a voice she had deliberately lowered by several octaves to sound like someone worth $9 billion. Her name was Elizabeth Holmes. And this is the story of how she built the most dangerous lie in Silicon Valley history, and almost got away with it. Welcome to Fortuna Files. Every fortune leaves a paper trail. And some trails are written in blood. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born on February 3, 1984 in Washington, D.C. Her father, Christian Holmes, worked for government agencies including USAID and Enron. Yes, that Enron. Her mother, Noelle, worked as a congressional committee staffer. They were not wealthy in the Silicon Valley sense, but they were connected. Old American establishment connected. The kind of family where ambition was not just encouraged, it was expected. From childhood, Elizabeth Holmes was consumed by a single idea. She did not want to be successful. She did not want to be comfortable. She wanted to be a billionaire. She told people this openly. She told a relative she wanted to be a billionaire so much she could barely think about anything else. She was a child when she said this. Not a teenager, a child. She was ferociously intelligent, deeply private, and possessed of a quality that would serve her extraordinarily well in the years ahead. The ability to make whoever she was speaking to feel as though they were the most important person in the room. Investors, scientists, politicians, journalists, they all reported the same thing. When Elizabeth Holmes looked at you, you felt seen. You felt believed in. You felt that whatever she was telling you must be true, because she was looking at you with such complete and unwavering conviction. That quality, that gift, is the most important thing to understand about Elizabeth Holmes. Not the technology, not the fraud, the eyes. She enrolled at Stanford University in 2002 to study chemical engineering. She was 18 years old. She lasted 1 year. During her freshman year at Stanford, Elizabeth Holmes worked in a laboratory run by Professor Channing Robertson, a prominent chemical engineering professor who would later become one of her most loyal and vocal supporters. She was studying the possibility of using a patch to monitor blood composition and adjust drug dosages automatically. And somewhere in that laboratory, surrounded by centrifuges and pipettes and the quiet hum of scientific equipment, she had an idea. What if you could run 100 blood tests or 200 blood tests from a single drop of blood taken from a fingertip? No needles, no tubes, no laboratory technicians drawing vials, just one drop, one small, almost painless drop of blood, and minutes later a complete diagnostic picture of your health. The idea was genuinely beautiful, genuinely revolutionary. If it worked, if it could possibly work, it would transform medicine. Cheaper testing, faster results, tests available in pharmacies and grocery stores rather than hospitals, early detection of diseases that currently go unnoticed until it is too late, lives saved, suffering reduced. The entire diagnostic testing industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry, disrupted from the ground up. She dropped out of Stanford in 2003. She was 19 years old. She used the money her parents had saved for her tuition to start a company. She called it the Ranos, a portmanteau of therapy and diagnosis. She was going to change the world. The problem that would take 12 years to fully surface and destroy everything, was that the idea did not work. It could not work, not in the way she described, not with the technology available, not with the technology she claimed to have invented. Blood is extraordinarily complex. A single drop contains an infinitesimally small sample. Running hundreds of accurate diagnostic tests on it was not a matter of clever engineering. It was a matter of basic biochemistry, and basic biochemistry said no. Elizabeth Holmes either knew this from the beginning, or she did not. And 30 years later, the answer to that question is still the most disturbing open question in Silicon Valley history. For 10 years, Elizabeth Holmes built the Ranos in almost complete secrecy. She recruited Channing Robertson from Stanford to her board, giving the company immediate scientific credibility. She hired engineers and scientists and imposed on them a culture of secrecy so absolute that employees in different departments were not allowed to discuss their work with each other. Nobody outside a small inner circle knew what the Edison device, her proprietary blood testing machine, was actually capable of. Nobody was supposed to ask. Those who did ask found out quickly that asking questions at the Ranos was a career-ending decision. Scientists who raised concerns about the accuracy of results were dismissed. Engineers who told Holmes the technology could not do what she claimed were fired. A culture of fear and paranoia permeated the company so completely that employees were afraid to speak in hallways. They were afraid to be seen eating lunch together in case it looked like they were colluding. Former employees later described working at the Ranos as psychologically suffocating, a place where the gap between what was being publicly claimed and what was actually happening in the laboratory grew wider every year, and where the consequences of pointing at that gap were severe and immediate. Meanwhile, on the outside, Elizabeth Holmes was building something extraordinary. She met former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz in 2011 at a conference. After a 2-hour meeting, he joined the Ranos board of directors. Then came Henry Kissinger. Then James Mattis, who would later serve as Secretary of Defense under Donald Trump. Then William Perry, former Secretary of Defense. Then Betsy DeVos, who would become Secretary of Education. She assembled what observers called the most illustrious board in American corporate history, a collection of former cabinet members and decorated generals and Washington insiders who lent the Ranos a credibility that no scientific validation could have purchased. None of them had a background in medicine or biochemistry. None of them were equipped to evaluate whether the technology worked. But all of them had reputations, enormous, irreproachable reputations, that Holmes used like a shield against anyone who might think to ask uncomfortable questions. In 2010, the grocery chain Safeway signed a deal with the Ranos worth $350 million to install blood testing centers in nearly 1,000 stores. In 2013, Walgreens partnered with the Ranos to establish wellness centers in more than 40 of its pharmacies. By 2014, the Ranos was offering diagnostic tests for more than 200 conditions. It was licensed to operate in almost every U.S. state. It held certification from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Forbes named Elizabeth Holmes the youngest self-made female billionaire in America. Her personal net worth was valued at $4.5 billion. The Ranos was valued at $9 billion. She was on the cover of Forbes. She was on the cover of Fortune. She was on the cover of Time. She gave TED Talks to standing ovations. She appeared on panels alongside the most celebrated entrepreneurs in the world. She wore a black turtleneck every single day, a deliberate, calculated homage to Steve Jobs, whose biography she had studied like a sacred text. She lowered her natural speaking voice by several octaves, a voice coaches later confirmed was an affectation, because she believed a deep baritone conveyed authority in rooms full of men who were not yet sure they should be listening to a young woman. She was the darling of Silicon Valley, the hyper-professional it girl, the eye of a hurricane of self-perpetuating hype. And in the Walgreens wellness centers across America, the Edison machines were quietly producing results that were wrong. Here is what was actually happening inside those wellness centers. The Edison device, the revolutionary proprietary blood testing machine that was the entire foundation of the Ranos, could not run most of the tests it was supposed to run. Of the more than 200 tests the Ranos advertised, the Edison machines could perform only a very small number themselves. The rest were being run on conventional third-party Siemens machines, standard laboratory equipment available to any diagnostic company, that the Ranos had purchased and was secretly using to process the majority of its tests. The patients sitting in those Walgreens wellness centers believed they were receiving a revolutionary new form of testing. They were, for most tests, receiving the same testing available at any standard laboratory, processed on machines any laboratory could buy, from a company that had built its entire $9 billion valuation on the claim that it had invented something those machines could not do. And the tests that were run on the Edison machines themselves produced results of such unreliable accuracy that the consequences for patients were not abstract. They were real, documented, devastating. Patients received false positive HIV diagnoses. Patients were told they had cancer. Patients received incorrect results for cardiovascular conditions. Patients made decisions about surgery, about chemotherapy, about the rest of their lives, based on numbers generated by a machine that its own internal scientists knew could not be trusted. Adam Rosendorf, the Ranos' laboratory director, later testified that he had informed Holmes directly about the problems with the Edison device's results. She brushed aside his concerns. He resigned in 2014. His replacement, hired to run a medical diagnostic laboratory, was Sunny Balwani's dermatologist, a dermatologist, running a diagnostic blood testing laboratory, serving patients whose lives depended on accurate results. That is not incompetence. That is not negligence. That is a choice. To understand the Ranos fully, you have to understand Ramesh Balwani. Known as Sunny, he was 19 years older than Elizabeth Holmes. They had met when she was in high school. She was around 18 and he was 37. By the time the Ranos was growing, he had moved into her apartment. Their relationship was kept completely secret from employees, investors, and the board for years. In 2009, Sunny formally joined the Ranos as its president and chief operating officer. He had no scientific background whatsoever. He had made money in software during the dot-com boom. He was now co-running a medical diagnostics company. Holmes later testified at her trial that Balwani had subjected her to psychological abuse throughout their relationship, controlling what she ate, when she slept, how she interacted with the world. Her defense argued that this abuse had affected her state of mind and her understanding of what was happening inside the company she founded. The jury was not persuaded on all counts, but the testimony opened a window into the private reality behind the public image, the gap between the blazing blue-eyed certainty Elizabeth Holmes projected to the world and whatever was actually happening in the private spaces of her life. Sunny Balwani was eventually tried separately. He was convicted on all 12 counts against him. He was sentenced to 12 years and 11 months in federal prison. He began serving his sentence on March 15, 2023, In October 2015, Wall Street Journal investigative journalist John Carreyrou published the story that changed everything. He had been working on it for months, speaking quietly and at enormous personal risk to former Theranos employees who had watched the gap between the company's claims and its reality grow until they could no longer stay silent. Theranos' legal team had attempted to suppress the investigation with threats and injunctions. It did not work. The article, published on October 15, 2015, raised serious questions about whether Theranos' proprietary technology worked as advertised. It was careful, precisely sourced, and devastating. Elizabeth Holmes went on CNBC the same day. She sat under the studio lights in her black turtleneck, and she looked directly into the camera, and she said, with complete and unbroken composure, that the Wall Street Journal story was, and these were her exact words, a lie. The performance was extraordinary. The composure was extraordinary. The conviction with which she dismissed the reporting of a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist was extraordinary. But the investigation did not stop. Regulators arrived. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services conducted an inspection of Theranos' Newark, California laboratory and found it to be so deficient that it posed, in their official language, immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. Holmes was banned from operating laboratories for 2 years. Theranos voided 2 years of Edison test results, hundreds of thousands of tests, notified patients that their results may have been inaccurate. The $9 billion valuation went to zero. Forbes revised its estimate of Elizabeth Holmes' net worth from $4.5 billion to zero. The youngest self-made female billionaire in American history had a net worth of nothing. In June 2018, a federal grand jury indicted Elizabeth Holmes on 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. She stepped down as CEO. Theranos ceased operations later that year. The trial began on August 31, 2021. It became one of the most watched criminal proceedings in American history, part legal drama, part cultural reckoning, part examination of everything Silicon Valley had allowed itself to become in the decade of unicorns and disruption, and move fast and break things. Holmes made 3 decisions at trial that defined it. The first was to separate her case from Balwani's, ensuring they were tried separately, so that her defense could use the alleged abuse without Balwani's lawyers being able to cross-examine it in the same courtroom. The second was to testify in her own defense. She took the stand. She spoke for days in a quiet, controlled voice, noticeably higher now than the baritone the world had known, as if the performance had finally been set down. She told the jury she genuinely believed the technology worked. She told them Balwani had controlled and abused her. She answered questions for hours without breaking. Whether she was telling the truth was the question the jury had to answer. The third decision was to appear in public throughout the trial as a visibly changed person, softer, more vulnerable, the black turtleneck replaced by warmer clothing, the blazing certainty replaced by something that looked more like a woman trying to find her way back from somewhere very far away. On January 3, 2022, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty on 4 counts of defrauding investors, not guilty on the counts related to defrauding patients. On November 18, 2022, she was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. On May 30, 2023, 7 months after sentencing, Elizabeth Holmes reported to the federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas, to begin serving her sentence. She was 39 years old. She was married to hotel heir William Billy Evans, whom she had begun dating after the Theranos collapsed. She had 2 children, born in 2021 and 2023. She walked into prison having given birth to her second child just weeks before her reporting date. Her expected release date is December 29, 2032. Elizabeth Holmes has never admitted guilt. Not at trial. Not in the New York Times interview she gave in May 2023 as she prepared to go to prison. Not in any statement made on her behalf since. Her lawyers have argued that she had a legitimate belief the technology would work, that she was a true believer who crossed a line she could not see clearly because of the relationship she was in and the pressure she was under, that the story of the Ranos is not the story of a calculating fraudster, but of a visionary who could not admit to herself or to anyone else that the vision was not real. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Nobody knows for certain which version is correct. There are people who spent years inside the Ranos, scientists, engineers, executives, who believe Elizabeth Holmes knew from the beginning that the Edison device could not do what she was claiming, that the fraud was intentional, sustained, and cold-blooded. And there are people who spent years inside the Ranos who believe she genuinely could not see the gap between what she wanted to be true and what was actually true. That the most dangerous thing about Elizabeth Holmes was not that she was lying. It was that she was so completely convinced of her own vision that reality had no way in. Both versions of this story are terrifying. If she knew, she put patients at risk for profit. She endangered lives for evaluation. She used the language of saving the world to do the opposite. If she did not know, she is proof that belief without evidence is not a virtue, that conviction without competence is not leadership, that the Silicon Valley mantra of fake it till you make it has a body count. Elizabeth Holmes did not build the Ranos alone. She could not have. She built it inside a system that was designed to fund exactly what she was selling, the audacious vision, the world-changing idea, the founder who believes so completely that they make you believe too. Silicon Valley in the 2010s did not just tolerate Elizabeth Holmes. It celebrated her. It funded her. It put her on magazine covers and invited her to conferences and gave her standing ovations. And the medical establishment, the regulators, the pharmaceutical companies, the hospital systems, watched a 19-year-old dropout claim to have revolutionized blood testing, and for years did not ask the one question that would have ended everything. Does it work? They did not ask because the board was too impressive, because the investors were too credible, because the idea was too beautiful, because asking whether it worked would have made them look like they were afraid of innovation. And in Silicon Valley in 2013, being afraid of innovation was the worst thing you could be. George Shultz's own grandson, Tyler Shultz, a Stanford-trained biologist who worked at the Ranos, tried to raise the alarm internally. He went to his grandfather. His grandfather chose the Ranos over his grandson. Tyler eventually became one of Carrie's sources, at enormous personal and financial cost. The legal bills from the Ranos' attempts to silence him cost him everything he had saved. A grandfather chose a company over his grandson because the woman running the company had made him feel, when she looked at him with those blue eyes, that she was changing the world. That is not a story about Elizabeth Holmes. That is a story about all of us. About what we choose to believe when believing feels better than questioning. About what we allow to go unasked when the asking feels like an act of cowardice rather than rigor. About what happens when the hunger for a beautiful idea overrides the responsibility to ask whether the idea is real. In 2014, Elizabeth Holmes was worth $9 billion on paper. In 2015, she was worth zero. In 2023, she walked into a federal prison in Texas. The drop of blood that started it all, the single drop that was going to change medicine, save lives, democratize healthcare, disrupt a billion-dollar industry, never did what she said it could do. The paper trail of the Ranos runs from a Stanford laboratory in 2003, through Walgreens pharmacies and boardrooms and courtrooms, to a minimum security prison in Bryan, Texas. And somewhere along every inch of that trail, the same question sits waiting to be answered. Did she know? This has been Fortuna Files. If this story disturbed you, If it made you question what you choose to believe, and why, subscribe right now and turn on your notifications. Because the file we are opening next week involves a man who stole billions from his own country, spent it on Hollywood films and a super yacht, and almost rewrote the rules of what a government is allowed to do with its own people's money. Every fortune leaves a paper trail. We will see you in the next file.